Picture this. You're a Roman citizen in 37 AD, and your new emperor just declared himself a living god. But that's not even the shocking part. What if I told you that this same emperor turned the imperial palace into something that would make modern tabloids blush? Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into history's darkest corners. Today we're talking about Caligula, the Roman emperor whose name became synonymous with madness and depravity. I'm going to share some stories that will make you grateful you didn't live in ancient Rome. But before we start, let me warn you, this content deals with mature themes and historical accounts that some viewers might find disturbing. If you're ready to learn about one of history's most twisted rulers, hit that like button, and let's jump in. Let's start with who Caligula really was. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, he got the nickname Caligula from the tiny military boots he wore as a child. His father was a popular Roman general, and little Caligula became the army's mascot. Nobody could have predicted what this cute kid would become. When Caligula took power at age 24, Romans were hopeful. His predecessor Tiberius had been a paranoid recluse who barely governed. People thought this young, charismatic emperor would bring back the glory days. Boy, were they wrong. The first few months seemed promising. Caligula released political prisoners, gave bonuses to the military, and put on spectacular games for the public. He was spending money like crazy, but people loved him for it. Then something happened that changed everything. About 7 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill. Some historians think it was encephalitis, others suggest poisoning. Whatever it was, when he recovered, he was a completely different person. The man who came back wasn't just cruel. He was obsessed with power and pleasure in the most twisted ways imaginable. Let's talk about what made Caligula's behavior so shocking, even by Roman standards. Romans weren't exactly prudes. They had different attitudes about relationships and power than we do today. But even they were horrified by what their emperor was doing. Caligula believed he was a living god, not just symbolically, but literally. He started demanding divine worship and built temples to himself. This wasn't just ego. This mindset affected everything he did, especially his relationships with others. When you think you're a god, regular human rules don't apply to you. And Caligula took full advantage of this twisted logic. One of the most documented aspects of Caligula's reign was his treatment of the Roman nobility. He would invite senators and their families to dinner parties that turned into nightmares. These weren't just social gatherings. They were power plays designed to humiliate and control. Caligula would openly discuss the physical attributes of senators' wives and daughters right in front of their husbands and fathers. He'd rate them like they were objects in a market. But it got worse than just crude comments. Historical sources tell us that Caligula would sometimes call noble women to private meetings. When they returned, everyone knew what had happened, but nobody dared speak about it. The emperor had absolute power, and challenging him meant death. Imagine being a Roman senator, knowing your emperor could take your wife or daughter whenever he wanted. You're sitting at dinner, trying to make small talk, while this madman discusses your family like they're his property. This wasn't just about physical desires. This was about power and control. Caligula understood that by violating social norms in the most personal way possible, he could break people's spirits. The historical records also mention Caligula's relationship with his sisters. In Roman culture, family bonds were sacred, especially within the imperial family. But Caligula apparently didn't care about these boundaries either. Ancient historians wrote that he had inappropriate relationships with at least one of his sisters, Drusilla. When Drusilla died, Caligula's grief was so extreme that he declared her a goddess. He made it illegal for people to laugh, bathe, or dine with their families during the mourning period. Anyone who showed happiness could be executed. This gives you an idea of how twisted his emotional attachments had become. But Caligula's behavior wasn't limited to his family or the nobility. He turned the imperial palace into what can only be described as a den of debauchery. Roman writers described parties that lasted for days, with activities that shocked even the most jaded Romans. The emperor would dress up as different gods and goddesses, acting out mythological scenes with unwilling participants. He forced senators and their families to participate in these theatrical displays. Picture this. You're a respected Roman official, and suddenly you're being forced to play a role in the emperor's twisted fantasy. Refusing wasn't an option. That would mean death for you and your entire family. Caligula also had a fascination with forcing people to watch these displays. He understood that making people witness degradation was almost as powerful as participating in it. The psychological impact of being forced to watch and stay silent was devastating. People started living in constant fear, never knowing when they might be called to the palace. The emperor's sexual appetite wasn't limited to women either. Historical accounts suggest he had relationships with men, women, and according to some sources, even engaged in activities that were considered extreme by Roman standards. Remember, Romans had different attitudes about same-sex relationships than many cultures today. What shocked them wasn't the gender of Caligula's partners. It was the violence and coercion involved. He would target the spouses of his enemies specifically to humiliate them. If a senator opposed him in any way, Caligula might publicly take their wife or husband as a way of showing his dominance. This wasn't about attraction. This was warfare conducted through personal violation. One particularly disturbing account involves Caligula's treatment of newlyweds. He would sometimes attend wedding ceremonies uninvited and claim the bride for himself. Imagine planning your dream wedding, only to have the emperor show up and destroy your life. The groom would have to stand there and watch, knowing that any protest would result in execution. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic campaign of terror. Caligula seemed to enjoy finding new ways to violate every social norm and boundary. He would auction off gladiators to the highest bidders, but sometimes the merchandise included nobles' family members. People would be forced to bid on their own relatives to save them from worse fates. The emperor also had a twisted sense of humor about his behavior. He would make jokes about his actions during public ceremonies, forcing people to laugh at their own humiliation. If you didn't laugh convincingly enough, you might find yourself becoming the next target. This created an atmosphere where nobody knew who to trust or how to behave. Everyone was walking on eggshells, trying to survive until someone could stop the madness. But who could stop an emperor who controlled the world's most powerful military? The Praetorian Guard, who were supposed to protect the emperor, were also terrified of him. Caligula suspected everyone of plotting against him, which wasn't exactly paranoia, since people actually were plotting against him. He started having people executed based on dreams he claimed to have. If he dreamed that someone betrayed him, that person would be dead by morning. This created a cycle where his paranoia made him more violent, which made more people want him gone, which made him even more paranoid. The financial cost of his lifestyle was staggering too. Remember how he started his reign by spending lavishly to gain popularity? Well, he never stopped spending, but the purposes became increasingly twisted. He built elaborate stages for his private performances and paid enormous sums for rare entertainment. The Roman treasury was being drained to fund one man's sick fantasies. People were being taxed into poverty to pay for their own oppression. Caligula would sometimes force wealthy Romans to leave him everything in their wills. If they refused, he'd find reasons to have them executed anyway and take their property. It was a protection racket run by the most powerful man in the world. What makes this even more chilling is how Caligula justified his behavior. He genuinely believed that, as a living god, He was above all human laws and morality. In his mind, everything he did was not just acceptable, but divine. This wasn't a case of someone knowing they were doing wrong and not caring. This was someone who had convinced himself that his worst impulses were actually sacred acts. The people around him had to pretend to agree with this twisted logic or face death. Imagine having to nod and smile while someone describes their cruelty as divine will. The psychological damage this inflicted on Roman society was enormous. People stopped trusting each other because anyone could be an informant. Families were torn apart by fear and suspicion. The very foundations of Roman civilization were being corroded from within. But Caligula's reign of terror couldn't last forever. By 41 AD, even his closest supporters had reached their breaking point. The Praetorian Guard, led by an officer named Cassius Chaerea, had finally had enough. Chaerea had been personally humiliated by Caligula multiple times and was determined to end the madness. On January 24th, 41 AD, the conspirators struck. They cornered Caligula in an underground passage of the imperial palace and stabbed him to death. But they didn't stop there. They also killed his wife and infant daughter. The conspirators wanted to make sure no one could continue his bloodline or claim revenge. When news of Caligula's death spread through Rome, people's reactions were mixed. Some celebrated openly, finally free from their nightmare. Others were terrified about what would come next. Civil war had always followed the assassination of emperors. But most people were just numb, trying to process what they had lived through. The Roman Senate immediately tried to restore the Republic, but it was too late. The military proclaimed Caligula's uncle Claudius as the new emperor. Claudius was considered a harmless bookworm, but he turned out to be a surprisingly effective ruler. One of his first acts was to try to restore some dignity to the imperial office. But the damage Caligula had done to Roman society couldn't be erased overnight. People had learned that absolute power could create absolute monsters. The Roman Empire continued for centuries after Caligula, but something had been lost. The idea that emperors were benevolent father figures had been shattered forever. Future emperors would have to rule, knowing that people remembered what unchecked power could become. So what can we learn from this dark chapter in history? Caligula's story shows us what happens when power has no limits and no accountability. His twisted behavior wasn't just personal, it was political. Every act of cruelty was also an act of control, designed to break people's spirits and eliminate any opposition. The sexual violence wasn't separate from the political violence, it was part of the same system. This is why many historians consider Caligula not just cruel, but genuinely evil. He understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. His reign lasted less than 4 years, but those 4 years left scars that lasted for generations. The lesson here isn't just about ancient Rome. It's about what happens in any society when power becomes absolute. Whether we're talking about emperors, dictators, or any other kind of leader, the temptations of unlimited power are always there. Caligula started as a popular young leader that people had high hopes for. Nobody could have predicted the monster he would become. But maybe that's the most important lesson of all. We can never assume that good people will stay good when given absolute power over others. The only protection against tyranny is making sure no one person ever has that much control. So there you have it, the horrifying truth about Caligula's reign of terror. This wasn't just ancient gossip or exaggerated stories. These were real people living through a nightmare that lasted almost 4 years. What strikes me most about this story is how quickly things went wrong. In less than a year, Caligula went from beloved leader to absolute monster. It makes you think about how important it is to have checks and balances on power, doesn't it? If this video taught you something new about ancient Rome, or got you thinking about power and corruption, smash that like button. And if you want to see more dark stories from history, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. I've got plenty more shocking historical content coming your way. What did you think about this story? Were you surprised by how extreme Caligula's behavior was, even by Roman standards? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.